You've probably heard that Homo erectus was just a primitive ancestor, a step between apes and us. But discoveries in Africa and Europe are forcing archaeologists to rethink just how advanced this ancient species may have been. Evidence that suggests they built structures and homes staggeringly long ago, potentially changing everything we thought we knew about memory, intelligence, and humanity itself. Hi guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Michael. I have a degree in ancient history, and on this channel, we discuss the unexplainable mysteries of our past. Let's get into it. In 1984, a fossil hunter spotted something in the dried mud of the Nariokotume River in Kenya, and it would become one of the most important discoveries in human evolution. You can see it here, the skeleton of a boy aged between 8 and 11 years old. Scientists call him the Turkana boy, and he died around 1.5 million years ago. But that's not the only really interesting thing about this discovery, because 108 bones survived, making it the most intact early human skeleton ever recovered. From the length of his thigh bone, researchers could tell he stood about 5'3". He weighed about 100 pounds, and if he'd lived to adulthood, he would have grown to 5'4", maybe even taller. In other words, almost the height of a modern man. But perhaps more interestingly is what they found up here. His brain was around 880 cubic centimeters when he died, but researchers believe that if he'd reached maturity, it would have been closer to 910. That's far larger than any human ancestor that came before, and about 2/3 the size of a modern human brain. He had long limbs, narrow shoulders, the kind of frame you see in people who live in hot, dry climates today. And inside his skull, there's something remarkable: an asymmetry in the left hemisphere, the area that would one day become our speech and language center. Now, he died from an infection. A broken baby tooth got lodged under his gum, and the pressure caused septicemia. Basically, he got blood poisoning. A sad end for a human who lived an almost unfathomably long time ago. But this wasn't just one unusually advanced child. No, this is typical of Homo erectus, which makes you wonder, what if this whole species was more like us than we've ever imagined? Homo erectus first appeared around 2 million years ago in Africa. The oldest known specimen is a skull from Drimolen, South Africa, and from there they spread across Africa into Asia, possibly even Europe. They were the first human species to leave Africa, the first to walk fully upright, like we do today, and the first to control fire. At Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, researchers found microscopic traces of wood ash dating back 1 million years. At Kobifora in Kenya, there's possible evidence of controlled fire 1.5 million years ago, with reddened sediment that could only come from heating at 200 to 400 degrees Celsius. Fire provided warmth, protection from predators, a way to cook food and make advanced hunting tools. It was transformative. The Smithsonian calls Homo erectus the most successful human species, at least so far. They survived for nearly 2 million years before fading out about 110,000 years ago in Java, Indonesia. That's roughly 9 times as long as our own species, Homo sapiens, has been around. While we know from the fossil record that we've existed for at least 300,000 years, they lasted almost 2 million. Imagine that. Nearly 2 million years in some of the harshest environments on Earth. You don't pull that off just by being tough. They had an edge, and it wasn't what you'd expect. What's especially interesting is that Homo erectus didn't just survive in one type of environment. They thrived in nearly all of them. Deserts, grasslands, woodlands, even burned landscapes, and zones with barely any water, and some pretty extreme temperatures. In 2025, researchers published a study in Nature Communications that changed how we think about their adaptability. They analysed evidence from Engaji Nanyori at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, and what they found was remarkable. Homo erectus was living in hyper-arid desert environments 1 million years ago, likely before our species, modern Homo sapiens, even existed. They visited waterholes that appeared after rain and hunted animals that came to drink. Professor Paul Durkin of the University of Manitoba, one of the study's authors, put it this way: their ability to adapt completely redefined their role. We think of them as wanderers, just trying to stay alive. But in reality, they were planners. They understood patterns in the landscape, where water formed, how long it lasted, and which spots offered the best chances of survival. But what's even more surprising is how they adapted. At Gona in Ethiopia, archaeologists made an unusual discovery. They found Acheulean tools and Oldowan tools at the same site, side by side. Acheulean tools are the signature of Homo erectus, large hand axes, carefully shaped, symmetrical. But Oldowan tools are much simpler, pretty much just flakes struck off a coarse stone. For years, researchers assumed that once Homo erectus developed Acheulean technology, they abandoned the older methods. But the evidence at Gona tells a different story. Homo erectus was using both. Depending on the situation, they chose the tool that worked best. The researchers at Gona concluded that Homo erectus had a, quote, degree of cultural and behavioral plasticity that has yet to be fully understood. In other words, they were making choices. They were showing real decision making. But even that might not be the full story, because what they left behind in Tanzania raises even more questions about their intelligence. In the early 1960s, archaeologist Mary Leakey was excavating a site in Olduvai Gorge. The location was called DK, and it sat in one of the oldest layers of sediment in the entire gorge. But what she found there stopped her cold. A circle of stones, lava blocks, stacked deliberately. The pattern measured about 4.5 meters across, roughly 15 feet in diameter. The stones were placed at regular intervals and piled up to about 6 to 9 inches high. Leakey interpreted it as a shelter base, or at the very least, a windbreak. She compared it to structures built by modern nomadic peoples, who stack low stone walls around their dwellings to block wind or support upright branches covered with skins or grass. But this site was dated between 1.75 and 1.9 million years ago. If Leakey's interpretation was correct, this was the oldest man-made structure ever discovered by far. The Guinness Book of World Records even listed it for a while. Now, just think about that for a second. If Leakey's interpretation is correct, this means that humans were building some form of shelter, some form of structure 1.7 million years ago. That's almost 2 million years earlier than this was thought to have occurred. If true, it's clear evidence of homes, settled life, and intelligence. But not everyone agreed. Critics argued the pattern could have been geological, or maybe the stones accumulated naturally around the base of a tree or something. No roof remains were ever found, there were no clear post holes, and without more evidence, it was impossible to say for certain. But this wasn't the only site, and the next one looks even more deliberate. Let's hop over to Germany, around 400,000 years ago. At a site called Bilzingsleben, archaeologists uncovered this. Multiple circular arrangements of bone and stone, each between 9 and 13 feet across. Some had what appeared to be post holes. There were also wooden tools nearby, a wedge, a digging stick. There were clear signs of organised activity. Nothing about this debris was random. Archaeologist Dietrich Mania, who led the excavations, was convinced that they intentionally paved this area. And around the same time, at Terra Amata in France, researchers found similar evidence. Oval huts, stones bracing wooden stakes, signs of fire inside the structures. 20 to 40 people could have gathered in each one. And at Chichibu in Japan, dating to around 500,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered post holes arranged in geometric shapes. 10 holes forming 2 irregular pentagons, with 30 stone tools scattered around the site. Chris Stringer, head of the Humans Origins Group at London's Natural History Museum, called it, quote, the first good evidence from 500,000 years ago of a hut structure made by these people. Together, these sites suggest something profound, a long behavioural thread from Africa to Europe to Asia, across hundreds of thousands of years, the same building habits, the same spatial organisation, which raises a question. Were they just building shelters, or were they building something more? Because now we're going to discuss even more evidence that proves beyond doubt the intelligence of Homo erectus. You know how I'm always talking about lost history? Well, there's another kind of hidden network shaping our world right now, and incogni is one of the few things protecting us from it. See, there are companies called data brokers that quietly collect and sell your personal information, your name, address, phone number, even your relatives and political views. And once it's out there, anyone can use it. Scammers, hackers, or just people who shouldn't have access in the first place. That's where incogni steps in. They contact these data brokers for you and automatically remove your personal data from hundreds of websites. And if you spot one they missed, their custom removals team wipes it too, completely hassle-free. They're even independently verified by Deloitte, so you know it actually works. And if you're not satisfied, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, totally risk-free. So take back control of your personal data and protect your privacy. Head to incogni.com/MichaelButton or click the link in the description below for 60% off an annual plan. Thanks to Incogni for sponsoring. Now let's get back to the video. There is yet more evidence that Homo erectus built structures and homes. At Melka Kunture in Ethiopia, archaeologists found multiple occupation layers stacked on top of each other. This was organized living floors with areas for tool making, areas for processed food, areas that appeared to be kept clean. And the same pattern shows up at other sites. At Gersher Benut Yaakov in Israel, almost 800,000 years ago, hearths appear in the same places over and over, with tools clustering into repeated work zones, and food processing happening in consistent spots. These layers were clearly intentional, built up by people using the same spaces again and again. They remembered where the good campsites were, where water could be found, which locations offered easy access to game trails. But crucially, both of these sites were exposed, open-air locations with no natural shelter nearby. So how did they survive? Well, I would argue they almost certainly built structures. If we apply Occam's razor, it seems more likely that these structures have simply decayed than the alternative, that these humans somehow survived outside with zero shelter. And back at Olduvai Gorge, archaeologists counted the bones. Over 43,000 animal bone fragments, all piled up in the same location. You don't get that from passing through once. That's clear evidence of repeated use, a site people returned to, or maybe stayed, over and over again because they knew it was worth it. That kind of behavior requires memory, planning, and teaching the next generation where to go and why it matters. Clear signs of what we today call behavioral modernity, modern intelligence, something that wasn't supposed to have emerged for hundreds of thousands of years after this date. And they likely built structures staggeringly long ago. But if they could remember places, then what else could they hold on to? In 2002, archaeologists working at Dmanisi in Georgia found something that suggested an answer. A skull, completely toothless. But the bone where the teeth had been was smooth and fully healed. This person had lost all their teeth years before they died, and they were quite old, well over 40, which was a good age 1.77 million years ago. So what's the big deal? Well, without teeth, you can't chew. You can't process raw meat or fibrous plants. You need help, which means someone in the group was probably pre-chewing this person's food for them and making sure they didn't starve. Professor Redefining, one of the researchers, called it remarkable. Here were prehistoric people surviving in brutal conditions nearly 1.8 million years ago, and yet their social behavior, their ability to care for the vulnerable, looked entirely human. And there's one more discovery that changes the picture. Footprints at Ileret in Kenya, around 1.5 million years old, made by multiple adult males walking side by side, moving together. Lead researcher Kevin Hatala called it the first direct glimpse of human-like social behavior in deep time. Multiple males cooperating, not fighting for dominance, but working together. So Homo erectus cared for the vulnerable, they moved in groups, they formed real social bonds, and those bonds may be what kept them alive for nearly 2 million years. So what does this all mean? For most of human history, we've told ourselves that civilization began with farming, that cities came first, and only then did we start building homes, forming communities, and that symbolic intelligence only emerged shortly before this time. But the evidence from Homo erectus suggests something very different. The roots of home stretch far deeper into our past than we ever imagined. Not necessarily as a building, but as an idea, a place you return to, a group you belong to, people who remember you. These ancestors survived, they planned, they built patterns, routines, and places that mattered. They cared for the elderly and the vulnerable. They moved together in coordinated groups, and they could well have built shelters and structures to make those places feel like home. Which all raises the question, if Homo erectus was capable of compassion, cooperation, and possibly construction, then how far back does modern intelligence, how far back does being human really go? Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, a comment, or subscribing down below. I'll see you next time.